Engines come in a ton of different shapes and sizes. They're arguably the most important part of any car. Lightweight, high revving 4 cylinders, efficient, reliable straight 6s, and yes, the all too important bald eagle V8s. We love them all here at Ideal, but we notice there are practically wars fought over which engine type is best, so we are going to settle it. Hit the subscribe button down here if you're new, and get ready to find out which engine type is best. Buckle up, let's go. Now, first off, we can't cover every type of engine because literally there are hundreds of different kinds. If you'd like to hear us talk about weird engines though, let us know down in the comments. Because in this video, we're gonna focus on the 4 most popular configurations. You got the inline-4, you got the inline-6, you got the V6, and then the good old V8. Now, we're gonna compare them by 4 very important metrics: how much power they make, how tunable they are, their size or what you can swap them into, and the price to buy or modify them. But first, let's start with talking about what the V's and numbers even mean. When you're talking to another gearhead about engines, well, you usually call them out by 2 things. First is the cylinder layout, which is basically how the cylinders are arranged. The most common are inline, otherwise known as I, which means all the cylinders line up in a line. V, which means the pistons go up and down in a V shape. And then the second part of the engine description is the number of cylinders. A V6 has, well, you guessed it, 6 cylinders, and a V10 has 10, and an inline 12 has 12. Yes, they made inline 12s. And the most common engines have an even number of cylinders, but it's not a hard rule. In fact, 3 and 5 cylinder engines are ridiculously smooth, and many World War II airplanes had a 9, 18, or 27 cylinder engine. That is a whole lot of spinning metal, especially way up in the air. Now that we're at least all on the same page, we can start comparing the big 4. And the first metric is the one that we all talk about the most, I'm sure. It's power. And we mean just overall, out of the box, which platform is gonna have the most. Now, more cylinders doesn't necessarily mean more power. That would just be too easy. However, displacement, which is the size of the engine itself, is often tied directly to power. And more cylinders almost always means more displacement, but not always. There are small V8s like the 4-liter UZ Lexus engines and big 6 cylinders like the 4-liter Jeep inline-6. But usually more cylinders equals more displacement. But it truly is true. I mean, the more displacement means more air and fuel that can be sucked into the engine. And that's the formula for making power. But it's only half the equation for horsepower. Horsepower is power over time. So while a gigantic 47-liter Brutus engine might have the same engine size as 10 Mustang GTs, it can't produce 10 times the power because the engine can't spin very fast. In fact, because of the ultra-high 7,500 RPM redline, the 2020 Mustang GT has more power than the gigantic Brutus. Yeah, crazy. Which leads us back to our 4 and 6 cylinder engines. Those engines have less rotational mass, and that lets them spin faster and freer. Now, modern engines are really high tech, allowing big engines to spin really fast, which means in general, and this is really simplifying things, a 4-cylinder will make less power than a V6, and an inline-6 will make more power than a V6 because they can rev higher. But there really is no replacement for displacement, which means that the mighty V8 is the winner in this category. But what happens if you start messing with the engine? And if you're subscribed to Ideal, well then you know that stock horsepower is only the beginning of the story. It's kind of the appetizer because the main course is doubling it or tripling it, and that's by turbocharging it or supercharging it and tuning out 4-digit horsepower. And that right there, nice. See, what engine is the most tunable. Let's start with what's not as tunable. And your average V8 is often expensive and just difficult to build up. Back in the day, your dad built V8s pretty easy, and it went kind of like this. New jets on the car, maybe an oversized cam, and a few hours polishing the intake. And with all that sweat equity, he gained a few easy ponies. Modern V8s though, they are so over-engineered that it's legitimately hard to get more power out of them. Of course, there are exceptions. We'd be remiss if we didn't mention the LS here. But overall, you're gonna work a bit harder to squeeze a lot of juice out of a modern V8. With the exception of a few well-liked engines like the Nissan VQ or VR series, there isn't much aftermarket support for V6s. And they're usually so crammed that they are really hard to work on. Ever seen the engine bay of a Z32-300ZX? It is literally a nightmare. They're either put into a base trim that could have had a V8, you know, like the V6 Charger, but yet the Hellcat is what everyone wants, or a way to give a commuter car a little bit more pep on the highway, like the V6 Camry that no enthusiast is driving. I hope. Are you driving a Camry? I hope not. They also have an inline-4, which, let's talk about inline-4s. And they're actually easy to tune because parts are smaller and cheaper. And the engine bay is usually less complicated, less crammed, meaning working on them in your garage is really no big deal. Also, manufacturers tend to tune 4-cylinder engines for economy. So that leaves a ton of room to tune it for more power. Plus, they usually have a ton of aftermarket support. But there are pretty much cults surrounding some of these engines where people will get 1,000 horsepower out of them. Yes, out of a 4-cylinder. Inline-4s are kind of like the tuner's first step. Easy, cheap, fun, efficient, but the masterclass, well, that belongs to the inline-6. The extra displacement of the 6, the strength of a V8, and the aftermarket of an i4. We don't have to really say much. The inline-6 dominates most of the top 10 lists of most tunable engines, with names like 2JZ, the engine that turns the otherwise pretty boring Supra into a $500,000 supercar. Yeah, $500,000. You should maybe go check out that video. Why? Actually, probably your favorite Supra ever. Or how about the RB26 DETT Skyline engine? Those things just love to be modified. Then you got the S54 and the BMW M3, a German 2J that mere mortals can push close to 1,000 horsepower. And let's be honest, with a pedigree like that, the i6 is the only engine that can win the tunability badge. So why doesn't every enthusiast car have an i6? Well, they are pretty big, which brings us to the next category. Believe it or not, engine size is the most limiting part of the drivetrain. Let's face it, while everyone wants a Coyote engine in their car, very few cars on the road have room under the hood. Now, it isn't as cut and dry as it seems at first, because while a V8 engine has the most cylinders and usually the largest displacement, some are very, very compact, including the pushrod V8 like the LS series, which can fit into the engine bays of many 4-bangers, like the V8 powered S13s you see in Formula Drift. Heck, you can even throw one in a Porsche 911. And not only does it fit, but it actually weighs 50 pounds less than the Boxer 6-cylinder. Crazy. So as you can see, this is where the universally loved inline-6 becomes kind of a problem. By having to line up all the cylinders, you end up with an engine that is just a lot longer than most other performance engines. And not only that, but because the crank has to be a mile long and needs extra bracing, inline-6 engines are often really heavy. That weight can be really problematic when you're trying to maximize handling as well. Not only is it hard to balance a car with a huge chunk of iron hanging over the front wheels, but the springs and the axles have to be beefier to handle the weight. It's why the Hellcat just doesn't take corners very well. And that's also why they moved the Corvette engine behind the driver for the C8. Weight and size, they're a huge reason why most cars just have a V6 or an inline-4, especially since so many modern cars have transverse mounted engines. You have to be able to fit the engine between the wheels. which means even cars like the Honda Accord, which isn't exactly a small car, has to use a 4-cylinder or a compact V6. And it's not limited to front wheel drive either. There's cars out there like the Lotus Exige and the Toyota MR2 that are mid or rear engine, but still use a transverse layout. I don't know if you've ever seen the engine compartment of an MR2. It's a miracle that a little 4-cylinder even fits. It is an itty bitty engine bay. So on the manufacturing side, they'll be sticking to inline-4s and V6s because that allows them to keep costs down. And it also lets them keep cars smaller so they can maximize passenger room. For the makers, it's math, and the inline-4 is the best engine. But what about engine swaps? And believe it or not, it's actually kind of tough to pick a winner here. If we're talking engine swaps, the LS is gonna make the case for the V8 as the clear winner. But overall V8s, they're big, expensive, and can ruin a car's maneuverability, meaning that maybe the V6 and inline-4s are kind of neck and neck here. Small, simple, cheap, lightweight, yeah, it's a tie. But why do people still tune 4-cylinders instead of just buying an LS if they fit so well? Or why don't people just learn how to weld? Can't be that hard, right? Well, because buying and modifying inline-4s are cheap as hell. That's why. Now, there's a common trope in racing. It goes, horsepower is equal to dollars cubed. Price is usually the highest barrier to entry for any enthusiast. We can talk about how V8s make great power or how inline-6s can handle a ton of torque and are super smooth. But chances are the first car that you'll be able to work on is the one that you can afford. But the good news is that so many people decided that their daily needed a sprinkling of fast, that most 4-cylinder engines have a ton of cheap aftermarket support. Look, it's easy to say an LS is cheap, but let's do some quick math. A blueprint drop-in 500 horsepower LS is $9 grand. You still have to install it in the damn car. Fabrication, labor, buying your friend's lunch to help, it really all adds up quickly. For the same price, you could build a budget Civic making 500 horsepower, and that's the whole car, not just an engine in a box. You're saving money sticking with under 6 cylinders. The Veloster N is a fast car, and it's cheap as hell for what you get. Same with the Civic Type R and the EcoBoost Mustangs. And they are all 4-cylinder cars. Sure, people might like to crap on the EcoBoost, but it makes 330 horsepower, which is more than a Mustang GT produced anytime before 2011, which, checking my watch, that wasn't even that long ago. I think it's pretty clear that the 4-bangers are putting others to shame with their budget builds. So, the million-dollar question, which is the best engine? A big V8, an awesome inline-6, or the humble inline-4? Well, let's be honest, because of the pure prestige of the engines like the RB or the 1J or just about anything BMW, it's gotta be the inline-6. Like, if we have to choose, it's an inline-6. But it really depends on what you want. Best for straight up building power? Well, you gotta get a V8. Planning on showing up all those V8 junkies with an overbuilt monstrosity? Go with the inline-6. Just make sure to get the right 2JZ. Do your research. And which engine is best on a budget? Well, stick with the 4. There are 1,000 horsepower Lancers out there, and you actually don't even have to look that hard to find them. There's just really no shame in low cylinder count. And the one engine that we didn't really mention, the V6, unless you're a VQ and a 370Z or an exotic one-off, you aren't really any part of the conversation. What is your ideal engine? Let us know down in the comments below. And also, if you're new here, please subscribe, turn on that notification bell, and hit that like button. This has been an awesome video. I hope it shed some light on the different types of engines and let you kind of understand why they're good, bad, and which one is the best. Inline-6. Anyway, this has been awesome. Thanks for all your support. And as always, keep living the ideal lifestyle.